So this is to the fantastic and slightly messy game that is Awesomenauts. And here's to hoping whatever the hell Geronimo is working on now ends up being at least half as amazing. This concludes my video on Awesomenauts, and I hope you all have a good day. Be safe.
This technically isn't going to be in the Blightbound review. This knows exactly what I'm asking.
I'm gonna cut it, and I might put it in the Blightbound review. But
how does it feel making a straight up more fun experience than Blightbound?
Well, so much for that. Hello everyone, it's Niz. I've been slow on reviews lately, and part of that is procrastination, but the other part is that I try not to make reviews until I get my hands on the full product. And both the games I've been looking forward to reviewing have been taking a bit to fully release. I don't hold it against either of them that much, but that's just the fact of the matter. And I'm really never sure if I have enough time to squeeze in a mini review. I might have an idea for that, but that's a subject for later. For now, I'm talking about Blightbound, a dungeon-crawling hack-and-slash RPG recently made by Geronimo, and published by Devolver. This setting takes place in a world in the aftermath of a battle against a behemoth called the Shadow Titan, a tyrannical being who had destroyed the sun. As if that wasn't bad enough, a sickening and corrupting mist flows from the corpse of the slain Titan, poisoning the lands and wiping out the apex civilization of the world, the Aetheri. The world is now perpetually dark, filled with monsters, and most kingdoms have been abandoned for a nomadic lifestyle. You place the heroes on Cinder Peak, living atop a mountain as a refuge at the height the mists can't reach, doing whatever you can to prevent the extinction of mankind, and to find their own peace in life themselves in their personal conquests. Blightbound had been in the works for a long time. There were a lot of people under NDA for the new IP for ages, and I had only guessed that it was likely a PvE game after a friend gave me information that they were looking for someone to help program enemies. Blightbound has 3 designated classes: the warrior, the assassin, and the mage. The warrior is a melee class that uses the law of brute force as they block damage to gain stacks of rage, which they use to increase the damage of their attacks and regain partial health. The assassin deals a low amount of damage with their normal attacks, but builds up stacks on hitting with their dagger, and can do an empowered attack that deals an immense amount of damage and marks the enemy to take more damage from all sources. The mage is the only primarily ranged class in the game, having relatively weaker attack patterns than the warrior, but having a stronger one than the assassin. But the mage also has the only healing ability on base. But unlike the other abilities, you don't get resources immediately in the heat of action by blocking damage or hitting an enemy, but by gathering mana orbs around the map. Although I am sort of cheating on this because you proc the mana orbs by hitting enemies, which each time you hit an enemy raises your chance of a mana orb spawning, and every time you spawn one, the likelihood of a mana orb spawning resets. One thing worth noting is that each class has an ultimate, and it charges naturally over time. Assassins gain 4% for each stack they use on their exposed weakness. Warriors gain 25% for using a stack of rage to attack, and mage gains 10% for each friendly healed in their healing wave, and when that mana orb is picked up, everyone gains 10% ult charge, while the one who picks it up gains 20%, meaning that you're rewarded to play the classes as intended. But instead of a support, tank, and damage roll, it's more like a damage with some tanking, damage with a healing ability, and maybe some CC or even a support ability, and a ton of raw damage. These are the basics that apply to every hero and class in the game, so with that out of the way, we'll be talking about the skills and passives. Titan skills and passives are abilities that vary from hero to hero. This also would include ults, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. While your M1 and M2 as any hero is focused around your class's resources, your Titan skills have a set cooldown and have an assortment of effects, most of which being a form of dealing damage with an added effect to them. They're also designed to scale off your hero's weapon power, meaning the higher tier your gear, naturally the more your damage will scale. This also means that abilities intended to deal damage scale significantly better. The thing is that these abilities aren't unique for each hero. These are reused abilities, and any ability that is unique for a specific hero is because they are a newer one. Said abilities tend to be added to the pool later on for new heroes and heroes who need a slight change in their power or synergy by swapping an ability out. This unfortunately leaves heroes sharing the same class with a lot of the same kit, and it doesn't stop there as there's even fewer variations in ults. During the first patch early access, all 3 starting assassins had Meat Grinder, meaning they only had 1 ult for the entire class. A little later, we got an assassin with the second ult, leaving pretty much all the classes throughout the game in early access with 2 ults each, both of which have the same purpose for functionality and balance. partially influenced by the fact that the charge rate is based off the class rather than the ult itself. This leaves 2 ults in each class with the same overall purpose, one that gives you an empowered effect that increases your damage output passively while allowing you to play normally, and even refresh or stack the effect if desired, and the other being a larger damage output comparably but not allowing the player to cast during it, but also having the benefit of giving the player iframes. This leads to a game where rather every character be a hero of their own, it feels like you're playing one of 3 classes, and the heroes themselves are predetermined loadouts of those heroes, which unfortunately make these heroes incredibly interchangeable. It also concerns me that certain abilities are given to certain characters as a form of balance. One example of this is how Kajuk was the best mage for a while because he had the best working abilities, a really strong passive, and arguably the best ult in the game. He greatly overshadowed Tekka, who had a pretty bad passive, an okay skill set, and an ult that was just useless. But don't worry, he got buffed to being just bad later. And this was balanced out by swapping their ults. I also find it funny that the mages have the best and worst ults in the game. But Sword tells me Ronimo was aware of Kajuk's strength and found it appropriate to nerf him by switching his ult out with something that they knew was worse. So what happens if this ult gets buffed for the sake of the mages who aren't good because of it, retroactively buffing a mage that doesn't need it? The last thing to talk about when it comes to their skills is their passives. The hero's passive is basically the one thing unique to them. They tend to also vary drastically in power, with passives that aren't good even if you build around them, passives that make the class objectively better at its job such as the starter heroes, and incredibly powerful passives that make them stand above the others in their selection. In their defense, Ronimo has slowly improved in their passives. Take Nobis Flan here for example. Nobis was the worst mage on release. He had one good Titan skill, the freeze ability, but that was a small AoE, so it's not really good unless you have gravity will to pull enemies in. Otherwise you're dependent on your allies to pull people in. His ult was Frost Skull, which as established earlier is the worst ult in the game. Yeah, Titans have mercy on anybody who played release day Nobis. While everyone on the stream was pointing out Nobis' skill set was weak, and as an extension, this mage wasn't very good, the community manager at the time, Slowwolf, correctly pointed out, despite this, Nobis had a very good passive.
That's also the guy who paints models, right, Niz?
Yeah, he paints Tau.
Oh.
A party-wide aura of healing 500% more from the mana orbs when you pick them up. The healing effect from the mana orbs usually being unnoticeable once you pick them up is now a major factor while he's around. This was actually incredibly useful because it's an instant heal that has unlimited range so long as you pick up an orb. It meant that your mage could heal you in a pinch without getting close or burning that resource. He doesn't have gravity pull, which makes it a lot easier to spawn mana orbs by hitting multiple people at once, but it's still pretty powerful for its time. At least it would have been if they hadn't released a legendary trinket that did the exact same thing that anyone could equip, and it also had pretty good passive bonuses. No. Better luck next time, Nilby. Well, now they changed his passive so that he can burn a mana orb to use an ability that's on cooldown, which is a lot better. Unfortunately, he only has one ability worth spamming, but still something that you can absolutely build around. But that fix was one of many rather useless passives, and it's a weaker version of another hero's passive, which kinda goes against the point of the passives to begin with. Frequently, Unleash Spirits isn't worth using at all. This is also the case for a few other abilities, some due to their ineffectiveness overall, and some due to a problem I have which I think I know the reason for. A lot of abilities in Blightbound, despite having free motion on PC, will snap your skill shot onto an enemy, which robs you of the aforementioned free motion that you may want in certain scenarios, like with the Chakram. Maybe I don't want it directly on one enemy, but in between them. I assume they did this to accommodate the console release, but they also didn't give the option to turn off this snapping, forcing people on PC to use it as well because it wasn't taken off of the PC version. Not worth investing an item into. But now that we're on the subject of items, we can start going into that. The heroes have one thing that varies among them, and that's their starting stats. No, not those stats. The only difference of base stats are among classes, no variation among heroes themselves. These starting stats. Some heroes will end up having more stats in certain areas than others. These stats can vary in usefulness for each class. Strength increases damage overall, agility raises movement speed and crit damage, vitality increases your max health, will reduces the cooldown of Titan skills, and luck increases crit chance while also increasing the level of items you find. Luck is typically something you want to take immediately, despite the flat 10% increase, the luck not being amazing unless you're committing to a crit related build. You can get increases in every other bonus these stats provide to you, but better items are especially a big deal in this game because weapons and trinkets are where your hero's strengths actually come in. One thing I can say positively about Blightbound is that it has good ideas to motivate the players to explore the majority of the content. Heroes give unique legendary items on their quest lines being completed. You have to complete their personal goals as well, which helps make sure you don't breeze through the quest too quickly. The core master has bounties that often require for you to go to certain levels to complete, and there is a class related token that only drops to the assigned class if you're either playing the class designated to it or all 3 versions during the level if you pick to get one of 3 random heroes, one of each class that you picked as your favorite. There's even the XP system, which gives you a large boost for discovering new heroes as well as rescuing survivors throughout the game. This raises your refuge level, which allows you to forge and find better items. The real tragedy of it all, though, is that despite all of this, the progression is still bad, and I don't expect you to take my word for it after I commended it so much. One leading problem is the constant lack of upgrades of any form when leveling the refuge up. A lot of this is due to them removing blight sickness while developing the game. When they did this, they removed upgrades that would raise or decrease stats based on your hero's level of blight, which was a really bad mechanic. Not blight sickness, mind you, just that some abilities would raise by 2 if you were healthy, and others would drop by 2. It would also do the same effect in reverse if you were on the edge of blight sickness, but you would get the same number of stat boosts one way or another. Most people saw this as a detriment to unlock rather than a benefit. It would end up messing with their hero's stats when they tried to stay healthy to reduce the blight sickness because it would make the hero unusable for a while unless you had a specific strong potion. It gave you these arbitrary boosts for playing safe, but also the same amount of boosts in different areas for playing risky, and most people would either be healthy and ignore it, a -2 stat boost in any area doesn't really make or break a character, or they'd have their blight health be half, so they can play their character normally, as they would get no positive or negative effect. I'm not going to rail on this too hard because it was an experiment and they removed it, but it also left a lot of empty space where progression should be, and all that's left are a few forms of refuge prosperity that aren't very good either. Outside of the crafting unlocks and earning stat points for your hero, prosperity ends up falling off. You unlock another hero around the midpoint, you get more Ethereal Sparks per minute playing the game way later, and region-based rewards. Region-based rewards are nice when you're on epic tier gear and you haven't gotten a full legendary set yet, but that's about it. And that's due to having a small item pool and having more than enough to craft for yourself late game, and all you need late game are the bounty currency. It's not terrible, it just loses relevance end game, but that's what bounties are for. Ethereal Spark per minute is an extremely bad upgrade and is definitely filler, as each one gives you 1 Ethereal Spark per minute, the main currency that you're using by hundreds if not thousands. They have an anti-AFK farming feature, by the way. Gotta crack down on the 24/7 Blightbound idle farm servers. I've crafted every craftable legendary item in the game and still have over 500,000 to spare. And this leads to a point in the game where I don't really want to go for barrels or chests for loot. I have failed impossible missions at the start or walked by a pile of loot that had easily gotten over 1,000 sparks. I found the level in the Grave Mark where you have to go to the catacombs and loot things to be a chore because even the ones with limited time, I knew there was going to be maybe between a couple thousand Ethereal Sparks and another bright ring. Most of the worthwhile equipment consistently drops from completion rewards, hero quests, or crafting, and you unlock these far before the Ethereal Sparks per minute upgrade. If you had all 4 stacks of Ethereal Spark per minute and wanted to idle farm a single metal plate from 0 Ethereal Sparks, the cheapest item to create spark-wise, you could maybe buy 1 of those by the end of the video. The items themselves vary in tiers, from common, uncommon, rare, epic, legendary, and blighted. Although the tiers affect how strong the item bonuses are, there surprisingly are lower tier items that still present a sense of value. For example, the increased DPS from Sunstruck Staff is a weaker alternative to emit Oxuxo's time. Oxuxo?
A lifetime of considering Oxuxo's 2 streams.
And doesn't affect everyone, but due to it being effective on shield mages, which provides a level of security, it makes a more effective alternative for buffing one person and safely making sure that they can deal the damage during the duration, making this a viable alternative for a safe DPS build or a mana pickup build. Although I worry that these items can keep up because sometimes legendaries can be pretty weak. Legendary items vary a great amount in their usefulness. Sometimes they end up being situational, but realistically speaking, why is Last Breath a legendary item? You shouldn't be finding yourself in a scenario where your ally is downed and you both apparently have no means of healing him back up whenever the invulnerability ends. Ronmo has some really weird decisions when it comes to making an item go from rare/epic to legendary. Part of it might be because some of these items were made in Create an Item contest, but I think those are standalone items that lack a stronger version. But sometimes the items skip epic, and there's even items that just stop at epic, presumably because the legendary version hasn't released yet. but also likely because these items are good enough to not need a legendary version. For an example of a weird upgrade decision, Blood Edge is a sword that gives the warrior 400 health and 4% lifesteal. This is pretty dang good because warrior's self-healing scales with health, and lifesteal means he is getting more health when using the Rage. Rage also empowers the attacks, giving you yet more health in doing so. But then with the Reaper, the upgraded version of Blood Edge, you give him 200 more health. Pretty good, makes you heal more of the rage stacks as mentioned earlier, but they also take away the lifesteal and replace it with ult charge, the class that needs it the least. If you're drawing aggro as warrior and properly burning your rage charges, you can keep refreshing Awakened Ancient no problem with no ult charge upgrades. Some of these at least lead to positive changes, like the AoE 100 damage on crit going into a 4-second snare on your E ability, which isn't damaging like the lower grade effect, but honestly I don't think Blightbound is in desperate need of more damage options and yet another explosion effect. Onto the hero items. The ones heroes start out with vary a lot in power, from being actually useless even if it assists your passive, to being a weaker version of a legendary effect for some reason. They all end up either way taking up space as they fall off and have no real use outside of that. As for the quest completion hero items, they all have different levels of power, but I'd have a hard time calling any one of them useless, as they usually bring something to the table that you can't get elsewhere and have a practical use. Unfortunately, a lot of them end up being not nearly as powerful with the hero that they're meant for compared to others, which doesn't sound like that big of a downside at first, but I want to run by some examples. Crom's story weapon is one of the more annoying to get, but pretty powerful. But it works better on Azun, who has a passive built around summons but can also buff them. Clegg is supposed to be a commander, so he should have a lot of soldiers on him, hence why he's given a passive that spawns a phalanx. And with his item, you can spawn one more phalanx, making him a pseudo-army, yet it's twice as effective on Azun using Crom's sword, which Clegg can't utilize, and Azun also has the buff that Clegg does not, completely overshadowing his theme and being more effective with Crom's sword than he is. There's also this weird thing where some of the legendary weapons have the weapon power they're meant to, but some of them are reduced, and some more than others, making them significantly less effective than other legendary items on the offensive scale, because basically everything scales with weapon power. And these reductions seem arbitrary and inconsistent. Friendship nearly halves legendary weapon power for warriors, and its whole effect is making the enemies take 20% more damage. Okay, so you're sacrificing a chunk of your power in exchange for an okay health boost and a useless skill boost because remember, damage scales with weapon power, making that damage boost proportionately lower. But you can also increase the damage your allies deal during taunt, I get the premise. So how come an item from an assassin makes Smoke Bomb give a flat 40 weapon power increase, while also giving crit power and movement speed, a couple of the best stats to possibly have on that class? Which feels like a small trade-off when a lot of abilities target you regardless of cloak. Another example is the Leech, which gives more damage to Meat Grinder and a pulling effect, with a crit and increase in lifesteal, but reduces the power by 25. Why is it weaker though? The stats are solid, but can be compared with other weapons, and the active effect will just get you killed by Blighted Convicts, one of the best enemies to use the Meat Grinder ult on. No, wait! I get stuff like Blightbane, because Blightbane is so powerful if used right, it doesn't need weapon power. Imagine this with the aforementioned Honor's Demand effect for example. It's a defensive staff. But the power difference of some of these items is ridiculous, like the staff that gives all friendlies a double attack speed after using Gravity Well, including summons. But I think the worst part so far is the Blighted items. So far in the game, Blighted items can only be achieved through Blight Rifts, and they are stronger versions of already existing legendary trinkets. My current problem with them is that there's nothing actually special about these items inherently, they're just better legendaries, and they're actually easier to get than legendary items. You don't have to craft legendaries to access them, you don't have to reach a certain prosperity for Blight Rifts to arrive, you can get a Blight Rift at any level so long as you have a full party. So I've had friends join me so that I could get blighted items in 0.7.
Literally just talk about the review, but you had to get a person who doesn't play the game a lot because, you know, there's no one playing the game, to do Blight Rifts, because you literally can't find anyone else.
And since it was a client-side thing, they got better blighted items than me. Although it was funny at the time that a friend of mine who only played the game because I dragged them along for the sake of footage, got some of the best blighted items in the game while I got canister. It was really telling that people who haven't gotten enough legendaries to fully equip a hero with them can easily get a hold of the strongest tier trinkets in the game at no cost. One of them had suggested if they're stronger versions of legendary trinkets, why not have them bring the legendary into the rift to make it a bladed item, and it'll prevent me from getting something like trap damage reduction. Even worse, I think bladed items are a waste of an idea when it comes to a new tier. The entire theme of them suggests a menacing aura. I feel like these items should be a double-edged sword. I feel that they should be made not ideal for certain builds or risky to use, but no, they're just legendaries with bigger numbers. The fact that you can take these challenges at any time in the game, the fact that there are 0 difficulty-based bounties for the items you need to craft legendaries, and luck stats playing a part in getting items and having them drop in the endgame, there is no incentive at all to play on higher difficulties where they have more enemies spamming annoying abilities while being spongier, damage that scales so hard that nothing but the absolute most committed tank building warriors can take more than 2 hits, which also makes mage less useful as healers, and elites that seem outright unfair. Look at this, I got a vitality potion. Stat potions are the most valuable endgame supplies you can get, and I got it on a difficulty level 7. Why would I go for the more completion rewards from impossible when I can get the same stuff quicker and more reliably from breezing through lower difficulties? Despite all this, however, I would say that the items in Blightbound are by far the best designed aspect of the entire game, and the usefulness of weapons and trinkets can drastically vary outside of their tiers. There are a lot of combinations that can go well with some of the passives in the game, and there's even a couple weirder builds that end up being viable, such as the Trick Bomb build, or the 3-hit build on Warrior, both of which work well with specific techniques in the game which make them more effective, and although both were unintentionally designed, they add a form of skill ceiling. Too bad there's no actual reason to test their limits due to the aforementioned lack of incentive to play higher level difficulties. But then there's a lot of strange legendaries that honestly either shouldn't be legendaries or have alternatives that are just as good if not better. Gravemark Headkey sounds like it would be better than Trick Bomb on paper, but there's no competition in execution. Part of it is because I'm using the bug where the bomb simply lands on the ground in auto arms, reducing the time. But even without that bug, it is fairly easy to get enemies into bombs, and there's a lot of items that slow or root them. Also, despite all of this, it is incredibly difficult to make your class effective outside of their main strengths. The ability to shield your allies as warrior when you charge through them is overshadowed by the fact to utilize it effectively, it puts you out of position as a warrior where you should be in the front tanking damage. Sure, Assassin can make Skull Piercer work as a ranged option, but it ends up being very weak poke due to it using one stack at a time. And it also goes against the Zerish Mark mechanic bursting down one enemy in particular, often leading to accidentally resetting your stacks. It used to be a lot stronger back when the M2 procced at dot, and enemies could be interrupted from their abilities to deal a large sum of damage as a bonus. A fantastic and powerful mechanic that rewarded assassins for vigilance. Why they removed these? No clue. Maybe they say on a stream, but please, I'm only one man and I've researched everything else. So now it falls off being an okay option if you're relying on ult and lightning charm for damage output. It's not a dead build at least. If I were to try to utilize Triss's passive to serve as an off-tank, I would need Venom's Vault to reliably proc dot outside of Deck of Daggers, or a build where I'm constantly using that ability, and I'd want trinkets that give raw HP, since otherwise Vitality is a complete joke for anyone other than the warrior. But this also leads to you doing so little damage that it can't keep up with all the other assassins due to the lack of damage passive and high crit multiplier. And what do you have after sacrificing so much damage? Getting 2-shot by the average enemies instead of 1-shot, and hopefully getting enough health from procs before you make another slip and die. My max health here is supposedly 2,910. I'm full health, down from an attack that deals less than my max health. It also says I heal for 2% of my max health as Triss with dot, which is 47 according to the healing, which would mean my actual health is 2,350. Which would explain why that blow should have left me alarmingly low simply straight up dropped me. I feel like an actual health bar as a HUD in the game would certainly assist in this matter. In fact, I felt this way exactly a year ago in the beta, and a couple months earlier in early access, but appears to be a low priority in Ronimo's list if at all. Which is weird because accurately measuring your health can be very important, especially if you're a warrior and the game has a tendency of covering up your normal health bar frequently. Your ally's health bar on your screen is much less likely to be obscured than your own. If nothing else, give me health numbers in my small health bar. Or even better, give me a bar system where each small bar represents a certain amount of health. Yes, I know it's a MOBA thing, but why should it be exclusive? I've gone this far without making comparisons, but at least with Ocelots starting out, you could accurately guess someone's health based off the bars. So even when it didn't have a proper health bar, there was a method. There is no reliable method here. This, along with the descriptions on items, proves it more difficult to get accurate information on the game when making builds. What ratio does Enchanted Skull heal? And while we're at it, what other than crit modifies the amount of damage you deal on certain items? In fact, what are even the damage ratios on a ton of them? There's no consistent principle. Fang Dagger deals 100 damage in a pulse on crit. There seems to be little to no deviation to this damage output, as if it's committed to dealing the flat damage as described, but not exactly. But Gravemark Headkey deals 350 damage, but I end up doing 1400. When I use it, I have no idea where the damage comes from. It also procs crit, so sometimes the flat damage itself scales, but other times not so much. And also from the description, would you have known how to hit someone with the Gravemark Key effect? Whether you'd have to blink towards the enemy or if the explosion would be away from them, I tested the thing thoroughly and I couldn't tell you without looking. A lot of them just say that they deal damage. Attack speed is especially infamous for this. Only through careful comparison could I conclude that Exoxa's Time and Sunstruck's Staff give an identical amount of attack speed boost. There's encouraging testing, and then there's leaving players completely in the dark as they give whatever items what power they please. Would anyone have known that Trick Bomb was one of the best assassin damage trinkets if I hadn't tested it? It's one of the few that proc backstab, and I'm not mad that it's powerful. It's got a delay that I substantially lowered through a few exploits, but it's still lengthy and costs your dash. The problem is there's no way of knowing that it would be this powerful, or how to make it stronger without trial and error and dumb luck or consistent scaling, along with putting numbers and ratios in the description would suffice. But if we're going to talk about misleading information, we're going to have to cover enemies.
The enemies in Blightbound are set to spawn in certain regions, but that doesn't actually stop them from spawning. Don't listen to the bestiary, it will lie to you. Meat Clots spawn the most in the mission they're not listed in. You will see pretty much every region exclusive enemy and any other level. I'm a little let down by that. Yes, if it worked properly, it would hurt the variety of enemies and levels, but it also means I could go to certain areas with more specific strategies, and go to any area ever without horrors spawning mouth traps, or just my strategy based on region or level. I can't do that due to character select being before level select, and every enemy being just about everywhere. And I know why they make you select heroes and loadout first. It's so that they can base the difficulty off party level. But as established earlier, every level just raises numbers and makes your average healer and tank fall off until you're forced to use super specific builds to break the system. Observe how in this hallway at the start of Descent, I deal with 2 Queen Beam Hags and a Writhing Oracle. How am I supposed to deal with this? I know a big part of the problem is that I have bots. I mean, look at them. They're trying. But even with friends, we've had a hard time doing anything so much as slightly deviating from normal. You could say that's the point of difficulty, but then I genuinely think you're settling for poorly designed difficulty. The generals are pretty much mini-bosses, and I want to emphasize I don't mean that they're a boss that isn't quite strong enough to be their own boss. I mean most of the time they're literally smaller versions of other bosses. Sometimes enemies will have elite modifications they often end up with. A lot of them just give you more Ethereal Sparks, and some give them a boost you may not even notice and also more Ethereal Sparks but not as much. Then you have some of the rougher enemies that like to spawn bone walls around you. The Vespers are already rough to deal with due to the walls that they make and the frequent mistake new players can make, avoiding their walls and assuming they're safe not knowing that they have an AoE around them when casting it. Some of these enemies make it incredibly difficult to win fights in any direct way. Have you seen an Eel Wretch? How are you supposed to survive this on difficulty where it does half your health on one knife? Fortunately, or unfortunately depending on how you look at it, there aren't a lot of enemy types like this. Most of the elites seem to focus on dropping more Ethereal Sparks for the player, being tankier, or spawning maggots. That one's a frequent theme. There are unique enemies with multiple elites just for spawning maggots. Maggots got their own elites, the only noteworthy one also dropping a lot of loot on death. So you could farm these enemies. The amount of unique features elites have that introduce new strategies while being fair are few and far between, leading to just most enemies having multi-fire or being a giant pinata, spawning maggots, or having a split attack function. And you would mistake every single elite for another enemy if they didn't have the little yellow text telling you it had a feature.
a lot of levels have lasers to complicate things, which is very annoying because due to how they design lasers on the map, they're usually not an issue because they're very well telegraphed, and if you get slowed by them, yeah, you're pretty much screwed unless you have a dodge, but typically these abilities are well telegraphed so that something that overwhelming should be expected. But sometimes lasers are put on the edges of a battle screen, and if you were going to go through them, you would be between laser and blight mist, a death sentence. Which means functionally speaking, it just decreases the size of the battle area for you. These maps also have spinning lasers, which are annoying to determine when you're in a safe area within the circle on them or not. And now onto the main bosses, who function near identically to the generals mentioned earlier. They tend to mimic the skills of enemies like them or even heroes. Not that their gimmick is mimicry, just that the Humongore has that ability that is just a warrior's soul. Only sometimes does the boss have distinguishing features. Other times the game has you fight multiple of guys that you fight before and with traps placed around the map. Yes, other times, plural, this happened more than once. In the main Scar room, you fight 2 of these centaur creatures. Earlier builds of the game, the genuine strategy was to rush on one side of the map so only one spawns in, kill it, and then kill the other. And recent changes in the Descent, they make it so that you're stunned until the enemy spawn, making them more consistently spawn together as intended. But it doesn't really change the bigger problem of this encounter that you're just fighting 2 more of the guy that you fight at the start of the level, and all of this part of the map is pointless. It's empty space with no encouragement to go there, yet they have spikes planted in this area as if players will consider it. I'm gonna make a strange comparison, but I'm going to take this over to Spiral Knights for a minute. Yeah, I know you're rolling your eyes. We're over a half an hour in the video, I haven't finished the gameplay segment yet, and we're talking about Spiral Knights for some reason. Just bear with me, alright? The reason is that I want to bring up the level Shadow of the Beast. Throughout this level, you encounter the boss you intend to fight. You see him go underground, showing his burrowing abilities. Bells are placed throughout the graveyard, and when used, stun enemies that typically spawn right next to them when hit, encouraging the player to utilize the bells and getting used to the range. The boss isn't just all show. He does even go as far as stun the player when they're going through certain areas, forcing them to go on the defensive at the start of a fight. This level demonstrates the gimmick and how it is used early on, shows you what you're up against and gives it a sense of presence, and builds up the anticipation for the upcoming battle. I will admit, the game straight up tells you need to use the bell near him to make him vulnerable, but if you were to walk past that with the things you've learned on your way there, it's entirely possible you piece that together yourself. It's not even that good of a boss. It forces you to stay in the middle and try to lure the boss out, which means you have to deal with its attack patterns until it goes for a bite. The bell's hit detection and the range is wonky, and there's nothing else to really factor into the battle, but the level was well designed and did a fantastic job building up a boss. Now compare that to Blightbound, where you'll already know what the final boss is capable of. You've fought enemies that behave identically to them up to this point. Snarbolax is a reskinned Wolver, yet is designed differently. There are distinct visual changes, and they add new mechanics to this enemy in particular to make them behave differently, up to the point where it's a new enemy itself. Other than damage immunity from bells and being able to make her own bone walls, Writhing Oracle behaves no differently from any of her daughters. And yet she's the best designed boss in the game due to such a low bar, and it's primarily due to the actual map gimmick that encourages the player to choose whether to prioritize the bells or the obstacles that make it more difficult to evade the orbs. But while we're on the subject of maps, why don't we talk about the map design itself? The art design of the backgrounds and foregrounds have been pretty alright from my experience playing the game. Mind you, due to the setting, I wasn't able to see it all as it was frequently obscured by darkness and fog. In this way, it does a good job at cementing the tone of the heroes as well as the survivors living off the carcass of what had been. Not a groundbreaking concept, but nothing really is. It's all about execution. And when you descend down the prison cells enclosed in mist and walk past these meat hooks, you get a very clear picture that not everything was super great before the Shadow Titans showed up and ruined it all. But let's not get too distracted from the fact that they reused the same map sets repeatedly in the same region. No, having you enter or exit from a different direction doesn't make it a different designed room. Usually this isn't bothersome. Games like Warframe have tile sets it reuses, but Warframe also has a lot of different environments that they have to work with. Blightbound has 3, and they're all generally the same tone due to how the story's written. You can have Dark Scenery that looks distinctly different, and they do. I wouldn't mistake the cold, stared locks and menacing steel of the Aetheri prisons with the mountains full of traps of flesh monsters made by hemomancers. But there's so little variety in the rooms themselves that the areas in the same region begin to all blend together because you've been down a pathway far more times than you may consciously realize.
There are 2 levels that avoid this. The one where you're randomly given 3 rooms to go through to get keys out of the 6 rooms that are in the level. And the one where you start on an expansive map on one random edge of it, and you have to clear a certain amount of rooms and return to the place you spawned in. I didn't see the maggot spawn a room until the 4th or 5th try. This is a step in the right direction. A game with this much repetition and enemy spawn and map design needs a ton of variety in its enemies and or environmental generation, or a tight and fun system that makes it worth memorizing to a science. You're not going to get either here. And if you want the latter, you're probably better off with the Awesomenauts mod of this game. No, there is no Awesomebound, I'm talking about Blightnauts. This is gonna sound redundant when I have already basically said this talking about the gameplay, but this has to be re-emphasized because it's even worse visually. The bosses are just mini bosses you fight throughout the game, except there are more of them or they have a different hat. The only exception to this seems to be the Humogres, who they have you fight twice in the area they spawn, and this enemy was presented on the cover of the game the day it was announced, so you know they wanted to hype it up. Yet his attack animations don't even look as good as, say, the Iron Pursuers, which aren't amazing. They do, after all, do this weird hand-raising motion, making a spear fire downwards. On the subject of enemy animations, they can be very rigid at times, not to mention that they sometimes use the exact same animations as other enemies or even heroes. There's also a lack of them being expressive. The common wretch will make an expression while attacking, but when they're getting dismembered, nothing seems to matter to them. I also don't really like that the death animations are all focused on a slash and kill, especially when the assassins are using daggers and the mage uses magic. Wouldn't it be great if the third attack on your hand animation as a mage grabbed the wretch and crushed him on the travel there? Or if you jab through the jugular if you're using a dagger attack? The game does have the enemy react if they were killed in the front or from behind, so that's something. The worst part is this form of injury and disembodiment only seems to apply to smaller enemies like wretches. Bigger enemies don't get torn apart or anything. They just keel over, turn gray, and disappear. And although they should be getting more desperate as they're being put on the ropes, they look no different from full health to the very last sliver. No tears, no bruises, or other injuries. They just flop over and dematerialize during their animation. The sheep critters and Awesomenauts during the Swords and Soldiers 2 promo were more expressive in their death. God, I really do stand Awesomenauts. That was a thing in one patch, which is a real shame because when they have an eye for detail, it can be great. Look at these bony protrusions that appear when the convict crushes the ground. But instead of just messing around with layers and just having them just drop down and sort of make it look like an animation as they recede back in, they become tentacles and slowly slither into the dirt. Are you kidding me? That's fantastic. But moments like these are few and far between, even for the heroes when it comes to their skills and abilities. I don't expect them to make a brand new attack animation for Skullpierce's knife throw. It'd be nice if they did, but I wasn't mad that they used the chakram throw animation. But I was annoyed that they didn't even bother to remove the chakram in that version of the animation. The chakram throw animation itself is at least well done. It's not just the bending of joints like other animations such as Lava Stomp. You can feel the flow of the animation when she throws it, and you can feel it as well on the return animation. Meanwhile, a lot of abilities lack a form of animation while the character is moving. So for abilities that don't force you to hold still while you're channeling, you'll very rarely see the casting. Thinking abilities have distinct visuals when you set them off, at least. I get that a lot of time the animation would be interrupted by attacks, but the distinct lack of attempt to give the abilities animations while you're moving makes it seem like a lot of these abilities don't have any animation at all. It's been so bad, it's been months since I've last seen a hero actually go through with the downed animation. I only remember that it's a thing because that one guy in answering the call. This leads to an uncanny valley sense as not only the heroes frequently rigid in their movements, but the lack of going through their animations most of the time leads to them feeling more devoid of life. My theory of a creature living inside the bodies these heroes pretending to be alive is further reinforced by their breathing animation. The only thing they have going for them in the realms of animation is that each hero has one unique idle animation. It begins and ends there. Well, except for the fact that there's one hero with a different walk cycle from the others in his class. He carries his staff with 2 hands.
Damn, it feels good to be a gangster.
You may be wondering why I'm going on this so hard when I enjoy a lot of other games that have a general outline that all the characters follow. Well, that's because character design is quite possibly Ronimo's strongest trait. Let's just take another moment to compare with Awesomenauts. These are Blightbound assassins. These are Awesomenauts assassins. These are Blightbound warriors. These are Awesomenauts tanks. These are Blightbound mages. And these are Awesomenauts supports.
And no, it's not because they have aliens. Osmots was also very good at distinguishing characters that share a species. This is a strong suit I fear they sacrificed entirely for the convenience of having a skin editor where you can make new heroes and add things onto characters more easily, which makes things more streamlined. Is that a hero that hasn't even been announced yet? This was a decision that limits the creativity of making heroes to strictly anything around their shape, which also limits things such as height, sex, and body proportions. And despite having this, they don't have the extra details they could in theory take time for, like visual changes for things such as trinkets. I can't make fun of my friends who are running Bright Ring, and you miss out on funny Easter eggs, like imagine a mage wearing 2 lightning charms, and he decides to tie them together and then make an occasional spark between the gaps. Cool stuff like that. But not only are characters replicas of each other in appearance and abilities, but they also have weak ties to each other in the world and story. Blightbound was a game intended to be more story-driven than any of Ronimo's previous titles, and yet I know less about the average hero than I do some of the Awesomenauts, and most of them didn't have any advancements to the lore after their day of release. And yet these heroes find the need to dump tons of exposition, usually in monologues while they're playing through levels, and then the other heroes, if they're programmed to, will give a response that just screams, "I'm not paying attention." Not all the heroes have programmed responses either, so there are many scenarios where a character will be spewing out their entire life experience, personality, and home's culture at a whim for the obvious purpose of giving expositional world building, and nobody will respond. Or sometimes it'll be people respond seemingly out of the blue and with the weirdest inhuman responses.
My friends, we've been through absolute hell getting here, but I want you to know I appreciate you coming with me.
I'm Azun, the Seeker.
Do as you like.
When Clegg comes in offering a meaning in life serving under his chain of command in an army, Triss says she wants to do that. The Scavenger, Triss. New world, new rules, Triss. It's not impossible, but I don't know why she would say yes, and have no idea what would bring her to do that. And I can already tell I'm overthinking a response most players won't see because she wasn't in the party at the time when you were playing Clegg in a specific moment. This moment was nonsensical and empty. This is not the only point something brought up is just taken at face value with no exploration on it. Azun speaks to Nilbus in particular to fix the wards to protect his clan from the Seeping Blight, who then sends him on multiple lethal quests to get him more Blight body parts, and he just trusts that Nilbus, the Blight addict, will come through with his side of the deal. And then he does. With no hitch or anything whatsoever. Apparently Nilbus was the only mage capable of this at the time, and was also completely trustworthy. With how this is executed, the only meaningful interactions are the ones where party members run into other characters on the map while progressing their quests, because that's the only time they say anything that's even relevant to what the hero's talking about. Which is a shame because it's not like they have nothing to talk about themselves. You can't tell me Chorus, the mage who specializes in studying the Blight, doesn't want to interact more with Malboris, a man forged in a Blight, and Nilbus, a Blight addict, or people don't want to approach him like Boo, when she realizes her uncle is smuggling Blight urns into rival locations. And then there's the fact that Azun would want to approach one of the most important members of the Motonaga clan, considering he has suspicions, which were correct, that they were the ones spreading Blight into rival lands, including his own. But they do nothing with this. That's because the story and interactions in-game are limited to their personal quest lines. There should be less interactions here, and more of them here. That way, there's more for the heroes to interact throughout the life of the game. They're capable of more organically speaking to each other as the plot progresses, making connections through things in common, settling feuds, and allowing characters in the same class to speak to each other, which you may notice you can't do normally. That's a direct limitation of this. Nearly a third of the character cast is absent from potential interactions, unless you put them on the map to talk to the hero in a certain room. There's also the issue that some characters have different levels of stakes in their story than others, which is to be expected in just about any story, but how intense these differences are is alarming. Malboris' quest is to learn the value of friendship because someone helped him solve a puzzle. Kreen is dealing with one specific blood magus who he robbed that keeps respawning. He's nothing really special. Nilbus wants to get another hit. Clegg wants to unite a fighting force to find a way to push back the Blight. That's quite a bigger deal in my opinion. Meanwhile, Khajuk is constantly maintaining the stability of time. He's keeping the flow of everything that has and will be, and it's treated like another personal quest. Then there's some characters who outright have no motivation to remain at Cinder Peak, and some have even more motivation to leave once their quest is completed. Scarlet's a relic hunter. She found her relic. Why would she stay? Boo learned that her tribe is committing atrocities, which are killing their enemies dishonorably and spreading the Blight's influence. Why would she stay, instead of going back and confronting them? Azun's entire motivation is to fix his wards, and he not only got Nilbus to repair them, he got them charged himself, and has a suspicion that they were sabotaged by a rival clan. Why would he stay? Because he said he felt like it? No, your people are going to need that ward back, and they're going to need to up their security. I don't want some heroes to be removed from the game once their quests are finished. I want them to be given a good reason to stick around. This isn't to say you know practically nothing about these heroes. There are bits and pieces of world building, primarily through items in the game, and side stories outside of the game. I have stated in the past that I do enjoy the world of games being fleshed out with side content, but games have to be careful not to depend on side content so heavily for context and lore that they end up pulling a Halo 5, and the side content being required to understand what's happening. I could say comfortably that you don't need the side stories on the website to understand what's going on in Blightbound, but they provide so much context and insight primarily that I can't help but wonder why some of the stuff isn't outright in the game. But it does seem to vary in the content. The first chapter gives more context to the tutorial and gives more information on the blacksmith, but later, it's used as part of the beginning and plot points that aren't things in the main game despite involving major characters, and explaining more the state of the factions that some heroes come from are in. It's really strange because apparently there's only one writer in the game, yet the writing in Blightbound's mini-stories are surprisingly better. Sure, they can be expository, but I feel like I'm reading actual stories instead of being told why this and that matters. The writer does a very good job writing stories in the perspective of heroes, although sometimes the characters will say really dumb stuff. There's also moments where they have a great amount of wit to them, but they also just nail home just how much we're missing in the actual game. Karog is depicted as being taunted by a voice that he gives to the wolf that he had slain as a child, which encourages his aggressive behavior and taunts him whenever he takes a cautious approach. And that encouragement and pride from his achievements is what leads to his mistake and has him now on a quest to put down his former allies and take responsibility as a leader. Roland's story is in the perspective of him writing letters to his cousin, and later in that story he has explained that he lied about the elder respecting him as an attempt to make himself look better, and he has to tell that he lied and give context of why the elder doesn't seem to respect him or even like him later in the story. It's qualities like this that turn these creations from walking tropes into living characters. No, please not like that. There's also an issue that the side stories add in events and content that simply do not happen in game. I get some of it could be side stuff in the downtime and the story isn't going to be one for one in gameplay, but about half the writing is devoted to an arc with a shapeshifter that, from my searching, isn't so much as mentioned in the game, despite its self-crossing paths with several heroes. But then there's the villains that are mentioned in the game that actually take place in the game's story, and I'm afraid I have to say I'm not impressed. Not that I think they were poorly written. Their actions aren't poorly written, they don't have much characters in themselves. Hell, I think the only well-written villain so far is Boo's uncle, who doesn't play a direct part in the game other than Boo mentioning him in her questline. But just to set it in perspective, we're going to go over the character analysis, and this time I'm going to go with Hemog, the Crimson One. To get context of Hemog, we have to go back before the Blight. The ancient powerful Aetheri were having a feud with a nation of people called Sinma's Folk, and Sinma's Folk were so persistent, so determined to win, that they followed through with a ritual to summon a Titan as the avatar in the mortal realm. This Titan was Kryus, or, as we know him, the Shadow Titan. His first action was to throw an Eldritch Spear into the sun, shattering and putting the whole world into darkness. The Aetheri disappeared after that, presumed dead. All that remained were their Magi Council called the Tutors. After 20 years, every nation had come together to confront the shadowy Titan directly, fighting it and the Sinma's Folk that defended the towering figure. But even with just about everyone in the world working together to create the 100 Nations Alliance, they were ineffective against the Shadow Titan. Hemog had been planning for this. He and the rest of the Blood Wizards had a ritual that they were preparing while this battle ensued. Several generals were wiped out quickly in this battle. We see this in perspective of Clegg, who narrowly avoids death while leading the 5th Regiment. It was an absolute bloodbath. They were able to kill the Sinma's Folk, but they were lucky to get even a cut on the Shadow Titan or his attention. Clegg remarked that the wizards can sit up in the mountain and fire spells from the safety of the battle for all he cared. Whatever ritual they had in mind, let them go through with it. And that's exactly what the Tutors did. With the ritual completed, they marked all the bodies, friendly and foe alike. They exploded into pools of blood, rised up to the sky, became a spear, and pierced the Shadow Titan, killing him instantly. Clegg states that they disgraced the bodies of these people by desecrating them, but I'm gonna be real, Clegg. Considering that this was a bunch of blood wizards working together in a council with all the confidence in the world, and they're told that they have to do whatever it takes because it's all or nothing here, in a ritual that is uninterrupted and unsupervised by anyone else, I'd just be happy that that's all they did and that it worked. But then, as we know, this led to the blight seeping from the corrupted form and creating toxic mists that made the monsters that the heroes fight today. But when the blight first spilled, Hemog was the first person to willingly enter it, confident that he could stop the spread. And then he got twisted into the strongest and first blood magus. He now resides in the mountains. He creates the flesh giants there out of corpses and instills them a urge to collect more out of hunger. This also fuels his powers as he gains more blood from the bodies for his rituals. He also is tied to the shapeshifter in some way in the side story, as he had created the phylactery and placed it within one of the mountain giants. What his ultimate goal is now with these powerful servants is yet to be seen, but what is known now is that he has an ever-growing desire for more bodies and more blood. So you fight Hemog and the Hemomancer, one of the first levels you unlock after completing answering the call, and you kill him even before encountering his Hemogers. But do you see all the major things he's tied to? And all the player's going to think after killing him is, god damn it, another bone cut. Hemog could have been a major antagonist, but he's a side boss of an enemy with a bigger health bar and no other discerning traits gameplay-wise, only to get trampled over and overshadowed by his creation. There's something ironic about someone so influential, venerable, and important to the lore to just be casted aside as the heroes turn their focus on one of his creations. But unfortunately, they do nothing with any of this. Just like they do nothing with several hooks they have, like how there are elderly characters surrounded by a generation who have never seen the sun. Not to mention some locations just not being explored further. Have you heard anything about Lorsdane after Scarlet mentioned it? I know it's a distant land, but we hear nothing of its involvement anywhere, or anything about it. We don't even get anything of them being a part of the 100th Nation Alliance. For God's sake, Sinnoh's folk are pretty much the actual antagonists in the past. We know nothing about them other than they brought up the Shadow Titan and apparently hated the Aethera so much that even after everything that happened, they seemed to feel justified in the end result. You could build a story around these people and figure out what on earth the Aethera did that made them so angry that they destroyed the sun, had hundreds of soldiers from every nation slaughtered, and had the world caked in a poisonous mist that forces everyone to live lives in paranoia and friction for what time they have left. And they still feel they somehow did the right thing. Now that's a hook. People would want to know why that's the case. They had to have a good reason to summon something as malicious even if it had influence on them afterwards. It's genuinely shocked me that they haven't explored Cinema's folk in more detail. They might in the future, but this is a pretty major thing to have hidden away. So yeah. Like in other forms of media, unfortunately, the best or even most important parts, other than the guy single-handedly preserving time in the world as well as some of these heroes, are in the actual game. And that's a shame. So, what happens now? So the first couple times I went through this, I had a list of things I think needed to be changed to improve Blightbound as an experience. But after trying to get a grasp on what they're making this game and what they have to put together, I've readjusted my list of what the game would need. Call me pessimistic, but I feel like this is more realistic. So I'm gonna get the verdict out of the way first. I wouldn't recommend Blightbound as is. It's repetitive in its art design and gameplay, and deliberately so. This allows them to get content out faster at the cost of one of Ronmo's greatest strengths, and having so much overlap that the heroes are completely dependent on story itself to really stand out and be anything more than loadouts and skins. All of this seems to be to use a tool that isn't being well utilized. So what does this game need? It needs better forms of progression and more things to keep the player committed to leveling up the refuge. They may need to introduce new mechanics that require leveling up to improve. Having a system where you gain things from the freed survivors now in the refuge is a good start. I know they're already working on that with artisan assistants, at least I assume that's part of it. Maybe even a challenge mode like Helldivers Wars or Payday 2's Hideout Assault, where survivors will help you hold the defense easier. Anything to make this feel like the refuge is growing somewhat with your progression. And fortunately, I think that's one thing that they have in mind. The game needs to rethink its higher difficulties as something other than drastically increasing the damage and amount of enemies, and rather making the enemies adopt strategies that make them more difficult to face. It also needs a better incentive to play on those difficulties to begin with. The bosses and map design should get a heavier focus. There should be more strategies within the environment for boss rooms, especially if they're going to be depicted as this massive. And the bosses themselves should have more interactions and more distinguishing designs to make them more than a reskin of a mini-boss, giving the main region boss things to do in other rooms and levels that put a hitch in the hero's plans would help teach the players what they're capable of, and give them more of an overshadowing presence. If you need your heroes to have the same abilities, you can at least have variations of their visuals for casting, and even mechanically sub-variations. I know you already have that with items, but this will go a far way in setting strategies and ideas of heroes on base without having to depend on their passive for an actual form of variation. I even kept a spreadsheet another player made around October for such an idea. Don't look at me like that, Core did a good job. If you're gonna have all these heroes be these silhouettes, I think you should at least have more body shapes for each class to give more form of variation visually. And for goodness sakes, please do something with the practicality of this tool, such as having the heroes carry trinkets, have more distinct effects for stuff such as bleed and poison, anything really. I've been following Blightbound's progress for over a year now, and I have to say, ultimately, that I am disappointed. I was disappointed with Indivisible, but this was more personal. I talked about this IP with friends a lot when Awesomenauts was discontinued, which I still think was the right call. They weren't making money from this anymore. If they don't have passion for it any longer, they'd only hinder the game working on it. But when I talked about this IP, and suspected it would be a PvE game, I told people my dream game would be a Ronimo developed game published by Devolver. But I didn't think it'd be Devolver. I figured it'd be, I don't know, Tiny Build. But when it was announced, I genuinely felt incredibly lucky. I remember saying distinctly, it is incredibly unlikely that a game like this would be poorly made. Even if it fails, it would still be a pretty good game. So yeah, my expectations have skewed this review a bit. I'm being so incredibly detailed now, not just because it's what I like to do in these, but also that the more I look into the game, the more problems I saw, and I came to learn something. Something that I honestly can't read this aloud from my script without a few shots of whiskey in my system. Ronimo got lazy with this. I don't say this as a suspicion, I am very confident with this claim. Look at how the heroes are made. If they gave people access to this tool, anyone could make the heroes with the assets that they set out. I'm pretty sure I see another hero that hasn't even been announced yet. They probably already have him ready for later. This footage is from March. I call this lazy because I refuse to call it incompetent. I respect Ronimo too much to think that they genuinely are incapable of giving their heroes a health bar HUD without collapsing their game, and coming up with enough skills to make less than half the heroes they have without overlap, and I know for fact that they can do better. They haven't rolled out very strong, and I hope that this will open some eyes and at least help improve the title. Who knows? It was practically a reverse miracle for this game to come out as bad as it did. Maybe they can pull the rug from under me and do a 180. Until then, there's no beating around the bush on this one. Alright, I'm not gonna lie, this audio I'm making in the midst of editing. You're listening to 1.0 NIS rather than 0.7. And this is the perspective part. Here's a list of the things I wanted changed in Blightbound. Well, a large amount of them, probably not all of them. And here are things that have been worked on or even fixed. Now you'll notice the list isn't entirely filled out. I'm not expecting it all to get filled out in one patch. There have been improvements, enough that caught me off guard because they all happened before I uploaded. I was gonna release this past 1.0, so I expected a few changes, but not as many as we got. But still not enough for me to say Blightbound is a good game. It's a pretty big improvement, though. And I'm going to stick with it for a bit. I was going to uninstall Blightbound after I finished uploading this. But this has given me enough faith in Ronimo, enough confidence to stick it out and see what they're coming up with next. To see if there's any more improvements, any more changes that'll come out after this. If they'll keep up the good work, or if this is just rose-tinted glasses. I wouldn't ask any of you to do the same, but I guess it's a bit of that brand loyalty. I wouldn't want this game to fail. If I wanted this game to fail, I wouldn't have put as many hours and resources into it as I did. And, so genuinely, if you're still listening, Ronimo, if you've gone through this entire review, thank you. Anybody who is still watching, obviously don't harass Ronimo for even the blunders I point out. And hopefully soon, a lot more things are going to get fixed, like how the mages were pretending to hold the staffs this entire time. I know they're magic, but hopefully the improvements keep coming, because this is a good sign. So I hope you all have a good day and be safe.